Hey folks, Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and today I am doing yet another edition of our Freelancer Q&A, often aimed at more like beginner type freelancers, but not necessarily. In this case, it is aimed in that direction. Today's question is, what is the best way to have clients pay you? I mean, maybe somebody who's more experienced as a freelancer would ask that, but I feel like this came from a relatively newbie or aspiring freelancer type source. So I will dive into that in some detail because, aside from the obvious answer of, as Randy Moss said once, straight cash, homie, there is some nuance to this discussion. So I'm going to talk through the different considerations that you might have around getting paid as a freelancer. And this is probably a good time to trot out my occasional caveat, which is I am not a CPA or a legal advisor or anything like this. Please do not construe this as any kind of official advice. Think of this more from the lens of if I were giving advice to former me, or if I were going to start over and start a freelance practice, this is kind of like what I would do and why I would do it is what you're really hearing about here. So as they used to say at head shops, this advice is not to be used for any purposes other than tobacco use. If you are using it to do drugs, don't do that. It might be confusing problem domains here, but at any rate, let's talk about having clients pay you. So I'll walk through a handful of things to consider here in setting out the way that you're going to get paid by clients. And I will also say that, number one, I don't know that there is a best way to get paid. And number two, I wouldn't recommend that you only have one way to get paid. In a lot of cases, you might have multiple payment type options that you could do. So let me walk through the different factors that I can think of in terms of like what you might decide to do. So one of the main concerns when it comes to receiving payment that you should think through and be aware of is when you're going to get paid and under what terms. So if you are coming from the salary world, you might think that everybody pays you like an employer, which is you do work and then, 2 to 4 weeks later or whatever, you have direct deposit. So you do work and then you get paid. This is not typically exactly how work will work in the freelance world. Sorry, payment will work in the freelance world. And let me kind of explain what I mean. So if you take a job and you are salaried, usually you have a payroll period that happens and then you get paid immediately after that. And there are probably workers' rights type considerations, at least in the US, that dictate the timeliness of that payment. So your employer, I believe, has to pay you within a certain amount of time, given when you completed the work, given when your period of salaried employment occurred. In the freelance world, you have a lot more options, and it will actually turn out to be kind of rare that you do work and then get paid like 2 weeks later. That's not a common payment term. One of the most common payment terms is what's called net 30. So probably this is what most businesses you work with will do by default. If you don't set up any terms, they will default to what is called net 30. That means that you do work for the time and materials period that you're talking about. So you go and you do freelance writing or freelance software development, let's say over the course of the month of December. Then you tabulate all the work, all the hours you put in, and in early January, you send them a bill for December's work. Usually, this is going to be construed on their end as a net 30 bill. So they have 30 days to remit payment to you. So you will typically, under these terms, receive payment, timely payment, in early February. For the work that you did in December. So if you're coming from the salaried world, this is a different sort of thing. You are used to doing work in December, and then if it's like a monthly payroll type thing, you would have gotten paid in like the beginning of January, or maybe it's even biweekly. So you're getting 2 drops a month on average into your bank account. Not the case with net 30. You could always try invoicing a client, net 15 or net 5 or something, here's this, or invoice due upon receipt. And I'll get into this more in a bit. It's uncommon that for services, like a client will probably just ignore you if you do that and say like, yeah, that's cute, but this is what I'm going to pay you. And you could always try to fight them, but you will lose. So I would think about net 30 as probably what's going to shake out. You will also encounter with bigger businesses, like if you were going to do some work for, I've done business with Amazon in the past. I think they do net 90. Some enterprises will do net 60. I don't know exactly the motivation for doing this. I don't think it's just because they can, although they can. If you're going to do business with companies like Amazon, usually they have a lot of money, so you're just going to kind of let that happen the way they dictate. But I think larger organizations also have more legal and compliance type things to vet on their side, so just executing contractor payments takes longer. So those are three common ways that payment will happen: net 30, net 60, net 90. Sometimes it's 120, probably as you get into really large type engagements. So those are some of the common payment terms. But you can also invoice up front. So for instance, Hit Subscribe tends to do this well cash flow wise. We send invoices before we do work. Now we can do this because our work is very well scoped in nature. So if if a client orders, say, 50 blog posts from us, we'll send over an invoice for 50 blog posts and then get started on the work. And those invoices, our terms are generally net 30, but we invoice up front. So this can be a way to make timing a little bit better. You could also get even more stringent about it and say, we're going to invoice up front and we're not going to do anything until you pay us. Or me, I guess, individual if you were a solo freelancer. That's another option that you have. You can collect payment before you do anything. This tends to work better if you have productized services or well-scoped work, or you're just like super in demand. Harder to do that if you're just going to come on and do like 6 months of app dev. Probably nobody's going to agree to that. But those tend to be your terms: upfront payment or net whatever. And you can also divide payments up into like installment plans. So you could send, in the aforementioned case with Hit Subscribe, maybe we're going to execute 50 blog posts over the course of a quarter. So we might work something out where we invoice up front, but then the client makes like 3 monthly payments or something. So those are the most common ways that payment might occur. And just to recap, I guess most vendor favorable to least would be full payment up front before getting started, or maybe a deposit up front before getting started. Invoice up front, but get started and invoice net 30, invoice in arrears, net 15, maybe net 30, net 60, net 90. So those are the various, let's call them liquidity or cash flow points that you have with payments. So another factor that will come into play here is, what is the client's preference for how they pay you? I guess let me talk about like media of payment as well. So I had kind of jokingly mentioned cash in the beginning. I suppose you could have somebody send you envelopes full of cash. Probably don't do that. A common thing for services is going to be that they cut you a check or they do an ACH into your bank account, some kind of direct deposit-y flavored thing with the bank. You can also then collect payment via credit card, or you can collect payment via services like TransferWise. I forget what all is out there for bank payments. Then there are services like PayPal or Venmo, etc. Now, these different services, there's a lot of variety in who they extract their fees from. So if you're getting a check, there's no real fees other than the cost of a stamp for the business to send you the check. So that's good. Likewise, if you're doing some kind of direct deposit arrangement, there is no or minimal fee for that. If clients are wiring you money, which is another option, typically you will incur a deposit fee on that wire, and they'll probably incur a wire fee on their end as well. Services like TransferWise, PayPal, etc. Some of them will charge you, some of them will charge your clients, some of them will charge both. So when you're deciding if and which of those services to use, understand who is going to incur those payments. So for instance, if you get set up and you decide you want to accept PayPal, unless you set up a PayPal business account and jump through certain hoops, the PayPal fees that come out of your pocket as the recipient can be pretty substantial. I remember in the early days of Hit Subscribe, we were sometimes collecting like 3K payments via PayPal, and they were taking like, I forget what, but it was not trivial. It was like $100 out of that. So be mindful of the services you engage, who is paying for those. And you could always negotiate something with a client. Like in the PayPal case, we might have upped the fee to like $3,100. But I would personally not do stuff like that. You don't really want to develop a reputation for nickeling and diming your clients. So you potentially want to select payment channels on the basis of who gets charged, what kind of costs you incur, depending on how frequently you're collecting payment. Another consideration there is going to be your client preference. So clients, especially if you're dealing with like larger clients and you're like, yeah, I collect payments via PayPal, they'll probably be like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. So your clients will tend to have preferences, especially if they have a large pool of vendors or 1099s that they're paying. They will, in that case, probably have their standard way that they want to run accounts payable. So this is true of hit subscribe, in any work that we have for like editors, authors, QA, like the folks that are in the contractor pool doing standard work. We don't negotiate like one off with that. We just, here's when we pay contractors. It's the second week of the month. Here's how we structure it. Here are the services that we use. So if your client has a setup like that, they're probably not going to be super interested in negotiating with you. So they might dictate the terms of how you're going to get paid. That kind of dovetails with another consideration, which is the client's rules, if you will. So this is going to be, it might be more informal with smaller businesses. They might say, well, we really don't like it, but I guess we'll pay you via PayPal. As the big business gets larger and there's like compliance concerns and like different departments and they have like a purchasing department, there will just be rules. That's the only way that they will deal with you. So then you just have to say, okay, what options do I have per the client's rules for dealing with payment, and is this acceptable to me, or do I want to pass on this business? Another concern, I guess, is in the overall amounts, like what size of payments are you going to be collecting? Because if you are doing productized services and you're doing payments that are kind of small in nature, you might accept credit cards, and that actually might be how your clients would prefer to pay you. If you're talking about particularly large fees, they might want to pay you in installments or something like that. So the actual amount of the transaction is probably going to dictate certain things about the nature of that payment as well. And I'll get into that here in a moment, actually, because I think what I'll do for the back half of this is break down based on payment amount, like what I would suggest that you do. And then the last thing here, I kind of touched on this, but like I made a note to talk about like fees and gotchas. So when you're investigating options to offer your clients for paying you, you want to be pretty mindful of the different payment terms with the different services that you line up for. So for instance, I mentioned PayPal as being particularly not the best, at least unless you do PayPal business. That can get your cost down for using PayPal. But you do really want to bear that in mind and kind of do your diligence on, if I accept payment via this service, what fees are there or what catches might there be? And by the way, another thing that you would want to look into is PayPal in particular does this. I don't know what other services might do as well, where if you go PayPal business initially, they will actually hold your fees for a while before they release them to you. And I think that's to vet that you're not running some kind of scam or something. But there are like unexpected surprises of that nature that you might want to kick the tires on or ask around about. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list of them, but there are, hiccups that can happen in the early days of receiving payment, unless of course they're just sending you a check. Like there's a lot of reasons to like getting a check. Lack of fees, it's pretty straightforward, etc. So that might be the route you go. And I don't necessarily mean like a actual physical check in the mail. It can also be like a deposit to your bank account. So that is kind of the different considerations that you might do. Lest I just enumerate and give no advice, I'll kind of give you rules of thumb of how I would structure it if I were a business. So I'm really going to orient this around the amount that you're typically charging with your service or productized service, ideally if you're trying to build up an offering ladder. If it's 3 figures or less, sure, you can take cash if that's on the table. But if you're selling an info product for $499.99 or whatever, you should probably favor setting up a credit card swipe, because you are modeling your productized service after an actual service. And a credit card is typically how a business is going to consume a service of that financial scope. There is a real advantage to doing this way too, because depending on the financial controls within a business, it can be substantially easier for an engineering manager out of their like discretionary budget to swipe a credit card or something. Easier to get approved a transaction that size if they can put it on a credit card than it would be to like generate an invoice and go through the invoice approval process. So at that level of charge, 3 figures or smaller, I would set up and prefer to take credit card charges. You will incur fees on that, like it costs money to take credit card charges, but it will likely be worthwhile because the volume of transaction will be larger if people can swipe a credit card. Now, let's say you're, so that's for 3 figures or less if you're doing things in that price range. In 4 figures, I would accommodate either one. Some people might want to do a credit card for this, for instance, whether it's productized services or not. If we were doing something like a small website rebuild, that was, I forget what we paid recently, like 7,000 or something, I would have been particularly content to swipe a credit card for that, get some miles. The way we pay, I think we pay like $5,000 a year for Ahrefs, credit card. So there are plenty of 4-figure charges that businesses will put on credit cards. So if you have a 4-figure typical engagement size, I would set up the infrastructure to be able to accept a credit card. But at this price range, depending on, again, the financial controls in the company, they might want to see invoices and write checks for that. So in that 4-figure range, you are probably going to want to accommodate either form of payment. If you're, selling things for $9,995, you might find yourself doing a lot more invoices. If you're selling things for $1,005, you might find yourself doing more credit cards. So within that range, you could, tune a little bit. But in that 4-figure range, if that's your typical, engagement size, I would be prepared to accept either one of those and to have either one as a first-class option for your clients. If you get into the 5-figure range, now you're really talking check. This is going to be payment with invoice. In that range, however, and maybe this is true at the upper end of the 4-figure range, what I would recommend that you do is define a good scope. So like a small website build out or, the hub and spoke bunch of content or whatever it is. So define something fairly well scoped, and then you're probably going to invoice and collect payment via check, but structure that up front. So send over an invoice and specify that you invoice up front. And at that range, 4 figures to decently into the 5, it's reasonable to expect a business to pay the full boat there up front. If they push back, you could say, all right, 50% deposit up front and 50% upon completion or whatever. But I would think in that price range, you're going to get paid via invoice and check or deposit. And you should collect that up front as much as possible. Now, as we go up from there, if you are doing 6-figure engagements, as is typical, if you can define a scope well enough to structure that like you did with the 4 or 5-figure to get paid up front, God bless, that's a pretty good deal. If you're into the 6-figure, there's probably a fair amount of variability and customization in that offering. This is the 6-figure range is where a lot of hit subscribes engagements are, for instance. So if we can scope and define those well enough, we will often send an invoice or like a bill of materials up front, if you will, but then work out a payment schedule because, a client probably isn't going to want to part with an entire half year's worth of work up front without seeing anything. And that's fairly understandable. Plus, if they're in the 6 figures, that can be a cash flow issue too. You're asking a lot of a business to, cut you a $250,000 check right up front, depending on the size of that business. And, but, beyond that, even if the business is large, the person you're dealing with might not have enough in their budget to just do that. So in the 6-figure range, you might send a bill up front. You might know everything, but you're probably going to pay that out or get paid in installments. And if you're doing time and materials, now you're getting into the territory where pretty much any business, if you're saying, well, I'm going to do software services for, 150 hours a month, they're going to want to see the work done before they pay you. So in that world, time and materials, now you're squarely in net 60, net 30, pretty much all the time. And then I guess 7 figures and up, maybe because the video is getting kind of long, I'll say like, hey, if you're in that territory, you might be sophisticated, well past the ability of me in this channel to help you. I mean, I imagine I could give you some advice, but I'm realizing as I started to get into that, I probably should have capped it at 6 figures and up, because if you are doing 7-figure engagements, that means you're probably pushing 8 figures a year in revenue. And, you've got a few things figured out at that point. I mean, I guess unless if you're, a freelancer and somebody's engaging you for a 5-figure contract or for a 5-year contract, that's maybe technically about 7 figures, but don't do that. So anyway, I guess 6 figures and up is where I would lead it. 7 figures and up, you're still going to, it's just larger in scale and scope of what I described for 6 figures, where if you're doing it well, you get the cash flow up front. Otherwise, in arrears, you're just doing a large scope of work. But yeah, if you're wondering about how to, you're probably not wondering how to get paid if you're doing 7-figure contracts. So anyway, I hope that is helpful to kind of break it down in terms of the charge amount there. That's how I would approach those things. And I would also revisit just from time to time, if you are used to collecting money through PayPal or whatever, sometimes better services come along that are more favorable to you in terms of payment collection or give you more options with your terms or whatever. So revisit it from time to time if you're a solo person. If you have a company doing your books or whatever, then they'll probably ping you every now and then if they have some better options. But, just make sure you check in on from time to time to make sure you are doing the best thing for you and for your clients. So hopefully all of that helps, and I will catch you next time.